Thank you, Matt. All right, good morning and good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. David, I think we'll get started here. Welcome to the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University, to one of our regular research colloquia here in the department. My name is Henry Thompson. I'm an assistant professor in comparative politics, and we are absolutely thrilled to be joined today by Professor David Art from Tufts University, who is a specialist in comparative politics, comparative political economy, and particularly specialist on the politics of Europe and Central Europe, including Austria and Germany. David Art has a long history of studying the radical right in Germany and in the rest of Europe. He published a book in 2011 with Cambridge University Press called The Development of Anti-Immigrant Parties in Western Europe, Inside the Radical Right. And he also published The Politics of the Nazi Past in Germany and Austria in 2006 with Cambridge University Press. He's also the author of many articles in comparative politics, German politics and society, party politics, and other leading scholarly journals. And today, we're really happy to have you with us, David. Welcome to ASU. And he's going to give a talk on the myth of global populism. So please take it away, Professor Art.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Henry, and thanks for the invitation from ASU and for all of you for being here. So the title of the talk is "The Myth of Global Populism," and it draws directly from an article that I published in Perspectives on Politics recently. And I guess one way to structure the talk today is I'm going to argue that the myth here is that there is this force called populism that has really been the major force at work in the most dramatic changes in advanced industrial countries, primarily the United States and Western Europe, over the last decade. So I'm going to argue that the myth, on the one hand, is that there's something going on in all these parts of the world and other parts as well, Latin America. But the second myth, perhaps, is a deeper one, and this might be that there is ultimately a solid conceptual foundation to populism itself. So I think that's kind of, as I've been thinking about this more, the stronger claim I might want to push. So one thing I thought about in working on this article and on the concept in general is I began with the notion of populism as an essentially contested concept. And I didn't really know a lot about this part of the philosophy of social science, but I read W.B. Gallie and sort of drew from there his notion that essentially contested concepts are concepts, as you can see here, about which involve endless disputes about their proper uses on the part of users. And thinking about populism, this seemed to be a great starting frame as any. It didn't make it into the final article. Perhaps we can talk about it later, but Gallie used democracy as an example of an essentially contested concept when he wrote this piece in the 1950s. And he was both critical in some ways, I think is a way to read it, but also optimistic about the long-term progress that the debate about these essentially contested concepts, that the process of debating them would be good for the accumulation of knowledge in some way. And democracy, he was arguing in the 1950s, as a concept that would be endlessly debated, that could not be contained in some consensus and then measured in a social scientific way. So he was skeptical about that in the 1950s. I think that, broadly, measurements of democracy have developed, and there has been a conceptual core around it, probably coming from Dahl and others. But I think that the notion that what democracy is, at least for political science, is essentially contested, I'm not sure if that's true anymore. So it seemed that their democracy was an example, and populism, perhaps, in the optimistic reading, would be one of these essentially contested concepts that through endless debate we can improve our knowledge of. But Galli also noted in this article that the essentially contested concepts are not the same from those which can be shown as a result of analysis or experiment to be radically confused. So really, that's a nice way of saying, I think, that some concepts meet this criteria, but others are just concepts that should be discarded. And I'm going to make a strong case, I think, today that populism qualifies as one of those terms. Why attack a central concept in the social sciences? I mean, it's probably not a good first article to write, but it mattered to me for a number of reasons. And before Trump, really, there was a large and growing literature on radical right parties in Western Europe. I mean, it almost dominated the literature on parties in Europe as a whole. But there had been some debate about whether the right term was right-wing populist or radical right, but people didn't sort of really fight about it or make a big deal. We kind of knew which parties we were talking about. So it was a term that was used in the literature, but it didn't explode as it did after 2016. And just some acknowledgments here. I got the ideas through this article from a couple of panels at APSA. In 2016, I was on a panel with Pippin Norris and Ron Engelhardt and Oliver and Ram and Justin Jest, and their work is all really interesting on this point. But I kind of disagreed with each in different ways, and I guess these disagreements continued, including through APSA's 2019 conference on populism and privilege. So I don't know, a long way of saying this is I've been skeptical about this concept had much utility for a long time, but once it was kind of bandied about as the new globalization or the new terrorism, the new meta-narrative for everything, it seemed, that there should be a critical voice. And I worry that the concept might itself be built on sand. So what I want to do in the remaining, 15 or 20 minutes, I want to leave a lot of time for questions, and conceivably some of you might have looked at the article. If you haven't, I'll summarize some points right now. But 5 things that sort of constitute the centerpiece of my critique of populism. The first is that it's really nativism that's at the core of what in the literature is termed exclusionary populism in Europe and the United States. So it's basically nativism most of the way down, if we want to explain what radical right parties are, how they mobilize, why they're successful. Point 1. 2, I think there's been a reason why the meta-narrative probably took off in the wake of the sovereign debt crisis, was that a far left started looking like a left-wing populist party on the same and bearing a lot of similarities to left-wing populist parties in Latin America. But I think that I would like to argue that if there was a populist moment for any of these parties, it's kind of since passed, and they remain, I think their best days might be behind them. The third point, and when I thought going in, this might be maybe not the most important of the 3 points, but I think it might ultimately be the most important. And that is conflating populism with competitive authoritarianism. And I'll get into why that's a problem in a bit. I do have some things to say on conceptual and measurement issues. That's another area in which I think there are problems with populism. But ultimately, I do have a normative point to make, that calling it populism really does matter. It matters in the political response to the thick rather than the thin phenomenon at work. So I haven't given a definition of populism, I'm realizing right now. And I think most who are interested in this topic might know Casamude, and his definition is I think the most widely used one, the consensus definition, and it describes populism as a thin ideology that divides society into antagonistic groups between the pure people and the corrupt elite. He also argued that the populism is always grafted onto another ideology, the so-called thick piece of populism. So Mudde's initial characterization of populism was, seen as a lot. I think the literature has accumulated kind of around that concept, and in some ways, I'm not sure I could even ever provide a better definition than it. So I'm not looking to replace it. But so what does this have to do with nativism and the conflation of nativism and populism? A lot of things. Those who have studied the radical right, and there have been study after study after study on this basic issue, finding overwhelmingly that it's anti-immigration, that it's nativism, that's the driving phenomenon. And culture is far more important than economics for understanding nearly every aspect of the radical right phenomenon. And skipping kind of through relatively quickly, the last point here, Trump was initially viewed, I think, by a lot as a product of that one could explain through basic economic models. That was Justin Jess talking about the rise or the loss of the white working class in the industrial Midwest. Norris and Engelhardt argument about a general cultural backlash that was occurring rather than just specifically a nativist backlash. So there were different perspectives, I think, on this question. But I think, as I note in the article, and reading the evidence from the American politics literature, it's overwhelming, as in the case of the radical right, that it's culture, primarily, anti-immigrant or racial animus, racial resentment, however Americanists measure it, that's really doing most of the work here. And this wasn't surprising to me, but it's perhaps more surprising was a point that I have here that cues me to talk about George Wallace just a little bit. And he's relevant here because a lot of the literature that was responding to Trump argued implicitly or explicitly that he was the long product, so to speak, of George Wallace, and that George Wallace was populist in the same sense that Trump was populist. He was cited in a number of papers as the forerunner. You can go back to Huey Long in 19th century agrarian movements, but Wallace is seen as the first incarnation, or the first significant post-war incarnation in American politics. So going through selectively, I suppose one can make the case that Wallace was primarily an anti-elite, ran on an anti-elite message. But as I go through in the article, this ignores a basic and just insurmountable fact that his career was based on opposition to segregation, and that was his political rise was all about. Now, Wallace is an interesting figure because he recanted that racism and actually won a governorship in the state of Alabama with a significant African-American vote. So it's a kind of confusing history, but make no mistake about it. George Wallace was a nativist of the highest order, and his populism, I think, can only be understood through that thick ideology of nativism. So I guess the big point that I would want to make on this first point is that it's kind of unfortunate that the lessons, so to speak, of the literature on the radical right were not quickly transferred, I suppose, to the literature in American politics on the Trump phenomenon. I guess that the findings accumulated relatively quickly, and you got the same basic thing, but it's there was no, in general, there when we tried to look at the populism as an independent piece of the puzzle of the radical right in Western Europe. So it wasn't surprising to me to see that the studies did not really find that thin aspect of populism, that anti-elite, that fundamental antagonism of society with a Rousseauian general will idea. That piece didn't really seem to be doing much work. What really seemed to be doing most of the work in the United States was racial resentment and anti-immigrant feeling in Europe. Second point that I lay out in the myth of global populism. This is inclusionary populism in Europe, and some of you might know the distinction between exclusionary and inclusionary in the literature. But as I mentioned previously, the mid-2000s were the high point of left-wing, what scholars claimed were left-wing populist parties. And I guess the way I see it is, if these parties were in fact populist, they were populist for an extraordinarily short moment in time. So it might have been a passing phase, but Syriza went within a space of 4 or 5 years from a group of former communists and anti-globalization activists, then suddenly the biggest party in Greece, but then signed on to and had a referendum on tearing up the hated bailouts that the European Commission, IMF, and European Central Bank had imposed upon them. That's the story of the rise of Syriza. Yet in one of the most remarkable, about faces in recent political history, Alexis Tsipras holds a referendum, Greeks vote no, tear up this agreement, but then he signs on to a bailout a mere days later. Podemos, a party in Spain, some of you probably know about. Podemos was interesting, is in the sense that it was no other party I can think of had students of populism and looking to put populism into practice within its ranks. There were literally disciples of Ernesto Laclau running things within Podemos. So they talked a lot about populism and the populist method. But as I go into in the article, that was a short-lived moment. And I'm left struggling, wondering at the end of the day how inclusionary populism is really different from the traditional leftism, as I have it here in the European context. One thing that I found really interesting as I got more into this topic was this piece on technopopulism and how it affects radical left parties. To back up for a second, one of the claims of the left-wing populist parties was that they are populist in the sense that they are fulfilling that direct democracy component, that they are allowing the people to really express the general will. And they promise to do that through the internet, through digital or digital democracy, techno-populism. Now, my computer skills are very limited, as is my knowledge of this this area of the literature. But it seemed to me that techno-populist moment kind of faded very, very quickly, where people actually did participate a little bit in the politics of Podemos and more so the five-star movement in Italy. But that kind of quickly gave way to the online referendum being used as a tool of the elite just to enforce party order, as Robert Michaels would have predicted in his argument about the iron law of oligarchy. So, I mean, the central point, there was a lot of attention given to Syriza and to Podemos, less so to the as a purely left-wing populist party, to the movement, the five-star movement in Italy, but it was definitely called populist as well. So these parties do remain in power, or have either are in power or have a legitimate shot, in Syriza's case, at power in the near future. So it's not like they've gone away. I just argue that populism is probably does not add anything really to the description of these parties, that the thickness that you already have in their ideology, anti-globalization, maybe, although that core concept has kind of gone back on as well. In any event, it's another argument here about the thickness of one thing and the fact that the thinness, the populism aspect, seems to be doing very little work. I guess the third way in which populism is, or the populism and another thing are conflated, and by so doing, one renders the other thing less significant than it should be. That was a very tortured way of saying this, I know, but are populists really kind of just competitive authoritarians, right? I think they are. And, I was surprised when I started reading more on this literature that that Viktor Orban was suddenly called a populist, for example. I think he's an example, what I give in the article, because Orban was not a populist in any sense. He was a mainstream conservative politician, not particularly charismatic, and yet, as most of you probably know, Hungary is, has had the deepest democratic deterioration of any state in Europe under the certainly within the European Union. So Orban was, included along with Chavez, Fujimori, and Erdogan as a populist Democrat, or as just a pure populist. But I don't think that's the right way to read this phenomenon, frankly. They're not populists, but they are, back to Juan Linz's classic distinction between loyal, semi-loyal, and disloyal political actors in democracies. They are semi-loyal and probably disloyal political actors. They are competitive authoritarians, and as I go in through in the piece, I don't understand what the populism bit adds to that. So one point that I didn't really go through in the article, but maybe we can discuss a little bit, are the enduring conceptual and measurement issues when it comes to populism. The Conference on Populism in 1968, if you read about this topic, you'll know that there was a lot of that this conference gets a lot of attention, primarily because there are some real intellectual heavyweights there. I mean, Isaiah Berlin, Ernst Gellner, anyways, that sort of cast of characters was unable to come up with any consensus on the meaning of the term. So if you kind of bring the best minds together in hope of consensus, you would populism proved too tall an order there. And there have been some there have been long-running critiques of the concept of populism. That it is, and one of those is that it's very difficult to think about what the opposite of it is. Is there a politics that is highly elitist, that is still democratic, but rejects any notion of a Rousseauian general will? So the opposite is very, very difficult. It's difficult to measure. Other people has made those points. I think more interesting to me is that when you try to measure populism over time, there's some really odd findings. So there's a couple of books that came out recently. One by Luca Minucci finds that in the 1970s in Europe, this was like the most populist era, even more populist than the 2000s, if one uses party manifestos or other common measurement schemes to go back and see the level of populism. The German SPD, for example, would be your prototypical populist party in the 1970s if you relied on this measurement scheme. Now, there have been a lot of more recent efforts to not use the comparative manifesto stuff, but to come up with populist attitudinal scales. But I think I'm equally skeptical of those. Here, for those who are kind of interested in the latest literature, would be what I would suggest to read. Don't let the title of the first article fool you, by Wuttke, Schimpf, and Schön, When the Whole is Greater Than the Sum of Its Parts. This is an incredibly dense, difficult to read conceptual piece, but I think it offers a really powerful critique of measurement strategies. Easier, I think, to get a handle on, although not yet in print, is work by Hunger and Paxton, What's in a Buzzword. And what they find is really interesting. They do a huge computer-aided literature review on populism, included in when it's included in the abstracts in journals. And then they run again another computer-aided search to try to get at the degree to which populism is present in the article itself. And what they find is it's mostly a label. That when people submit articles, they use populist because it's like in the keyword, or it might help publication, or maybe editors suggest it. So a huge number of articles that involve populism as a keyword have very little to do with populism. Of those that do, these authors find that most of the studies are really on the thick aspects. The nativism piece in the radical right, the anti-globalization piece, or the redistribution piece for the so-called populist left. So they're really, doing the literature in general, right, kind of doesn't involve this deep, refinement of populism. Not to say that others haven't really worked with this concept, and in some ways I'm a contrarian here, because a lot of people will tell you that populism is real, measurable, and useful for the study of other concepts. And finally, I had a chance to read this piece from one of your colleagues at ASU in political behavior, and the authors here kind of find, to my heart's content, that it's mostly host ideology that drives vote choice for populist parties. I hope I've done justice to the argument there, but it's a really nice study of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, and its voters in Germany. Okay, I want to save time for questions, so I think I'm going to wrap up relatively soon, I promise. And I want to just come to the point about why it matters. And here's the normative point. I think the use of populism really obscures, or can potentially obscure, what is a nativist or authoritarian core of political actors. In the case of the left-wing populists, I wouldn't call them competitive authoritarians or nativists. I'm less clear on what the ideological core is, other than anti-globalization and extensive redistribution. But I think that calling Trump, right, a populist was a mistake, and I think that it's really obscured, as I said, the nativist piece for a bit, although people weren't fooled, I don't think. And the literature, as I said before, broadly, confirmed the view, that was not surprising for a candidate who opens who comes into politics through birtherism, and who opens his campaign, campaigning against Mexicans. It wasn't surprising, I think, that we had all this confirmation that he was nativist, even though it took us a while to get there. I think it also obscured, though, as I particularly in the last year, the competitive authoritarian piece. Whereas Trump might be really, and this is, perhaps the scariest thing to emerge in the last 2 to 3 months, is that competitive authoritarian, that semi-loyal political actor to democracy, that piece we did not highlight perhaps as much as we could have. It's not like no one was prepared for what happened on January 6th, but we had signs of competitive authoritarianism before that. The Ukraine, for example, leveraging your role as leveraging your position as the executive, as the foreign policy head of the United States, using that position in order to get dirt on a political opponent. That's the weaponization, pardon the cliche, though, of tilting the playing field in your direction. Well, part of the definition of competitive authoritarianism. No, I'm worried about the possible waste of academic resources and time, of course, if populism proves to be, kind of um, a degenerative research paradigm, perhaps. And I'm not saying it's necessarily will. Again, this is just being skeptical, partly for skepticism's sake, I suppose. I do think that this idea that somehow the losers, that it's a question of economics at heart that's driving the phenomenon of what we call populism, but really mean nativism, that it will lead to really misguided policies. I mean, winning back the quote unquote white working class, that might be, redistribution might be a good political goal in its own right, but it's not likely to work if it's primarily a cultural nativist message that's at the heart of the appeal. And I think finally, there's a temptation sometimes to view populism as having some normatively redeeming features, right? That it allows, according to one view, it allows previously unheard voices, right, to be heard and to push elites into actions they might otherwise take, right? That's maybe perhaps the strongest justification one can make for populism. But I'm skeptical of that as a justification alone. And I think that the dangers, right, of calling it something by this term are much weightier. So finally, I have a picture up here of Isaiah Berlin because I like the quotes that he had in 1968. And I think he was basically right that the search for populism was going to be a fairy tale in the sense that, Cinderella's a fairy tale, that it might not be successful. And, more recently, Roger Cohen, well-respected columnist for the Times that specializes in Europe, also wants to do away with the word populist. And I kind of endorse, I suppose, most of those views. So, yeah, I've covered a fair amount of ground here, but it's only 35 minutes, so it's time to be quiet and take questions.
Well, thank you very much, David. That was an excellent talk. I'm going to throw open the Q&A for people to type questions in. We don't have any open questions yet, so I guess I'll take my convener's privilege to ask you a question first, which is about your concept of nativism. If populism is perhaps not an essentially contested concept, but perhaps even radically confused, to use this nice terminology that you introduced at the start, why is nativism a better concept? Is nativism just a synonym for nationalism? Is there a positive and negative pole of nativism? Is it simply opposition to immigration? And if it's simply opposition to immigration, why don't we just call it opposition to immigration? So I guess my question is, you're so opposed to the use of populism, you think it's nativism. Why is nativism a much better concept?
It's a very good question. And I think that if I spell this out more, that will definitely be a piece that I would fall back on. And, do I have as crisp a definition of nativism as Moody has come up with for populism? I'm not sure. Moody has a very great definition. He has a great definition for nativism in his work as well, which I broadly think, yeah, this works. This is measurable. And we are also finding that it has real world effects, right? So in that sense, I'm much more confident that nativism is not a mirage, right? And it's a concept that we can agree on more. Now, of course, nationalism is, that as a topic had a surge of literature in the 1990s and got into a lot of definitional debates too. So could certainly have those. But I guess at the end of the day, I see just nativism being, and as you say, anti-immigration, kind of explains most of it, most of the phenomenon. That's what my research on radical right parties kind of taught me. Very few of my interviewees would speak in terms of, oh, we're against the elites and we're looking for the Rousseauian general will. Yet they would go on for hours and hours about immigration. So the subtitle of the book that I did on the radical right was, pretty sure I should know my own subtitles by now, but it was The Rise of Anti-Immigrant Parties in Europe. So I called them exactly that. And I went through a discussion in there about why I didn't think populism was great. But you're absolutely right that if I want to really, spin out this essentially contested bit, which I didn't do in the paper, but might do later, I do have to come up with a section on why nativism is better. But it would be on those on some of those terms, that it's an empirically observable phenomenon to the degree that populism kind of hasn't been. We've been able to capture nativism and have a broad agreement on what it is, which parties are nativist, which aren't. We could do better on that. I think there could be more of a nativism scale and an anti-immigrant scale. But even there, the data from the European Social Survey and most of the survey instruments are really quite good. So there's been, I guess, my empirical experience, but maybe not my theoretical, right? I know it exists in practice. Now I just have to come up with the theories of why nativism is the better paradigm, or is the better conceptual lens through which to view it.
Great, thank you. I'm going to keep fielding questions here. We have a question from one of our graduate students, Chen Jiang, and it has 3 parts, so I'm only going to select one. I'm going to exert my power here to select one, which I think is particularly pertinent to you. She asks, is the geographical pattern of radical right support a promising direction for further research?
Sorry, one more.
Is the geographical pattern of radical right support a promising further research question? So I guess the question is, can we see interesting patterns in support for what might be called populist parties, but you would call nativist parties across space in Western Europe or the rest of the world that might be a promising direction for future research?
There are some really interesting studies going on about the power of localism, and more work on I guess from geographers kind of, who are applying sort of like those living dynamics, right? That's an interesting view of a really micro definition of location. But we have areas that tend to vote really radical right? Sometimes blocks. So, what accounts for that? And there have been some studies. Jennifer Fitzgerald has done a really nice one from the University of Colorado. She wrote a book that focus on the power of local geographic dynamics. So yeah, that's a really promising area. I'm not sure if that's the question exactly, but I think another way is the question of, is this the future of democracy in other places? And that's a really tough one. That's a really tough one to answer. I do think that there is this force called populism in other parts of the world, which I did not mention in this article a lot. It did not pay much attention to India, like Modi, for example. I had my universe of cases to places I knew more about, and not really not in America, to be honest. But I do think that there's been a misreading of what we see as populism there too, in India and in other countries outside of what I've discussed. That nativism and competitive authoritarianism are really the driving forces, and that populism is is a rhetorical strategy for some of these elites, is a thing that journalists call it, is this thing that social scientists like to call it, but I'm not sure they're campaigning on anti-elitism, anti-globalization, Rousseauian general will, putting people in charge. That doesn't tend to show up in what I know about parties outside of Europe. So I do think the argument kind of has global dynamics, so really broad, but also maybe most interesting, very, very local dynamics that depend on geography. Like simple stuff like, commuting times, or, what was the, not just the socioeconomic status of the area, but, internet availability, all sorts of neat things that Jenny Fitzgerald goes into. So yeah, I don't want to take too much more time, but good question.
Okay, I'm going to keep moving through here from Lenka Bustikova. Great hearing from you, David. I enjoyed your Perspectives article quite a bit. I agree with you, but I think the concept of anti-establishment attitudes is useful. It becomes useful when we link corruption and populism. For example, valence populism or technocratic populism can identify configurations where anti-establishment sentiments are invoked successfully without invoking ethnic, religious, or cultural divisions.
Yeah, you're right. I need to look more into that. And I think, Lenka, thanks very much for the question. And I appreciate the comments on the article. And we'll talk more about that, I hope. It's one of the nice things about doing these things, gives me something to think about more. What I'm saying mostly applies to the Western European cases. The search for these anti-establishment attitudes doing independent things. I grant the point that maybe in Central and Eastern Europe, there's slightly more there. So, I can be educated on that. I guess then I would ask more, fine-grained questions about, measurements and some of those things that the authors of the APSR article go into it in great length. But I see the point that maybe under certain circumstances, those anti-establishment attitudes might operate independently. Still, I think the logic of my argument is, probably to show that those are pretty, not the overwhelming number of cases, although that's not the right way to think about the phenomenon. So I take the point. It's a good thing to look at more.
Thank you very much. I have another question here from Craig Calhoun. It has 3 parts. I'll try and lay this out clearly. It says, I agree discussions of populism are radically confused, but I wonder how much your account is shaped by starting from cases of radical right authoritarianism. 1, your analysis never considers either of the 2 historical cases most associated with the term. A, the US populist movement of the late 19th century, and B, Peronism, which stands behind Ernesto Leclerc. 2, your account seems to be entirely of leaders and parties and their ideological appearance. This seems to me to leave out movements. 3, a feature common to the 2 cases and many allegedly populist movements is an effort to mobilize on broader bases than class or interest group, though I acknowledge this is true of lots of other isms as well.
Great. Henry, could I ask you to summarize the 3-part question again?
Absolutely. So it's about whether your account is shaped too much by from radical right authoritarianism, i.e. perhaps a little bit your expertise in Europe. So sure. A, discuss populism at the end of the 19th century. I think here he means the radical criticism of the gold standard by some actors, and Peronism, which you also mentioned at one point about Latin America. Secondly, right. What about movements, not just political parties? And finally, what about this sort of general trend for populist movements to mobilize more broadly than just class or interest group? And this kind of gets to my question about nationalism as well. If it's not classes or interest groups, is it perhaps nationalism?
Okay, I'll try to get to some of those. On the US populist movement or the agrarian movement, yeah, I've thought about that a lot. And interestingly, there was a material that didn't make it into the paper. There was a similar debate about what drove that movement. And if I'm recalling correctly, there was a claim that it was essentially, or there's a debate between of similar order between culture and I think economics at the heart there. I'm not recalling it particularly well. I decided though that that actually at the end of the day, that populist movement, it had the name populist, but I'm not sure it shared the fundamental features of what we are observing today. So I take that point, and I think fleshing this out more, I would need to deal with that a lot more and kind of make similar arguments, I suppose, that I made about the misreading of Wallace as a populist rather than a nativist force. So on Latin American, this is where I usually get a ton of pushback from Latin Americanists who say, well, this concept is born, it's perhaps born in different places, but where I know it best is from Latin American, from Peronism. And I do think that populism kind of might be a great term for a couple of cases there. I'm not sure it's the term that I would use beyond Peronism. I'm not sure that it is that it captures the Chavez phenomenon. I really would like to lay out an argument more along the lines of what I did of Viktor Orban, that calling him a populist obscures the competitive authoritarian, the program of democratic breakdown that he had in mind all along. So those later manifestations of what we call left-wing populism in Latin America, I think look more like competitive authoritarianism. But you're right that thinking about those two historical cases, probably it would definitely be worth fleshing out more. Those are very broad questions. I'm not sure I can answer all of them, but it's great to have them. It's given me something to think about. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Here from Tim Peterson, another faculty member in our department, which I think addresses partly your critique of populism not having a negative pole as a concept. So this is
sorry, I didn't get that.
This partly addresses your critique of populism not having a negative pole.
Okay.
So the question is, do you think the term populism can be salvaged by considering it in an institutional context rather than as a social movement? Populism as a social movement seems tragically ironic because it almost inevitably becomes dominated by elites. But the idea of inclusion of ordinary citizens in democracy can be understood in terms of democratic institutional features like PR, unicameralism, automatic registration, and it does have an opposite Madisonian-style institution based on elite checks and balances.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. That's an interesting point. Is that not just, though, the expansion of democracy itself? Is that wouldn't that be, my rejoinder is, why do we need to go to populism there? Can't we find perhaps within Dahl, ways of extending the contestation, moving to polyarchy, right? Why bring in populism for that? And I guess I found Dahl kind of useful in my career, and I guess a Dahlian in some ways. So perhaps that's my training speaking. But I see where you're coming from, but I would call it something different. I would bring it down to its basic, take away the thinness of the concept and focus on democracy as the thick piece of that phenomenon. So I'm not sure. Populism as an institutionalizing more direct citizen participation, seems to me very close to that one dimension of Dahl. But it's a good point.
Great. I have another question from Fabian Neuner, who you know, a faculty member in the department. He asks, how can we combine two concepts that point in opposite directions in terms of social desirability biases, i.e. pro-people and pro-democracy ideas are socially desirable, but nativism is not socially desirable? How can we properly study this concept when the two main independent variables are subject to such divergent biases?
One more time, I'm thinking through that. How can we?
It's an interesting point where Fabian is arguing that the concept of populism contains sub-concepts that point in opposite directions. So pro-people and pro-democracy are desirable, but nativism is not socially desirable. So he's, I guess, asking, is there not a core incoherence to this concept because these sub-concepts are pointing in divergent directions?
I understand, yeah. Well, I think yes. I think yes, that is one problem there. but I thought he was gesturing to something else that that those folks from the University of Mannheim pointed out in their piece, that the measures of populism kind of assume that to be populism you have to have A, B, and C, and then they weight the degree of populism on having, oh, I don't know, 10% of A. So you fill out categories A, B, and C, right? But the overall measure doesn't say that you need to like hit that that they all go together, that you need to have all of these things, right? So you can have something that's populist with high scores on one and kind of low scores on the other two dimensions. So they kind of lay out in really, laborious detail, really, but this kind of measurement issue at the heart of most studies of populism. So that's one reason why I, kind of share I guess Fabian's skepticism as in the way I read the question. But we'll talk more about that, I'm sure.
Great. I have a question from Jeremy Browning, who would just like you to elaborate more on thick versus thin political ideologies.
Sure.
You've mentioned that populism is based in nativism is thin. Can you explain what would be considered thick?
Got it. So yeah, that was my fault. I went over it very, very quickly in the talk, but it refers, this thin and thick comes from Kasmude's definition of populism, where he specifically defines it as a thin ideology. And I think his reference point there is Michael Frieden. But he defines it as a thin ideology. Hopefully find it right here. A thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and that argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. So that's the thin piece. And then the thicker pieces are the host, synonym for that would be the host ideology. So you can have a left-wing populism. Populism's the thin ideology. The thick or the host ideology is the left wing piece. And kind of in general, what I've been arguing is that by looking for the thin, we miss out on the thick. And if it's mostly a thick phenomenon, what's the value added at looking at the thin part, particularly when the thin part doesn't even hold up very well. I'm struggling for a metaphor for when something gets too thin to be of much value. But yeah, so that's I should have defined that better. But it comes directly, that terminology thick and thick, which people are now using in the literature on populism, comes from Mude.
Okay, great, thank you. Esteban Espinoza asks, how do you view patriotism? How can we distinguish patriotism from populism, nativism, and nationalism? I noticed a lot of people on the far right use patriotism or nationalist sentiments to justify their rhetoric on immigration, the Second Amendment, and the call for less federal government.
Yes. I guess there's a couple ways. I mean, the cheap answer is that it's not such a difficult thing to see through the narrative that it's basic. We're patriots, right? This might be more of a rhetorical tool than anything else. If you're calling for an absolute halt to immigration, if you answer questions, at the level of your sort of animus toward immigrants, is that a question necessarily of patriotism, of service, of how you feel about the state itself? I mean, so I get the point. There's been a ton of literature, I think, but it's older now about patriotism, nationalism, nativism, which I if I want to go more on this topic, I certainly would want to think more about that, how I can defend nativism as this piece, which is distinct, which is thick, but also is distinguishable from these other concepts. Nativism is it nationalism? Sure, in some ways that's, but nationalism has, totally different, basic cues in the literature too. Like if you think about nationalism, you think about Gellner, you think about imagined communities, you're probably not thinking about these studies that we have more now, which really kind of measure degrees of racial animus and link it to voting behavior. So yeah, more questions, I guess.
Okay, great. Alex Martin asks if parties ever actually call themselves populist, or if it's simply a label applied by analysts and political scientists.
Yeah, good point. Very, very, very few. They don't say we're populist at all. No part, none that I know of says it, with the exception of Podemos, the students of La Classe, right, which sort of really loved having intellectual discussions about populism and what it meant. They're the major exception, but none of the other parties call themselves populist, would use that. Now, after 2016, when populism suddenly became the word of the year in all sorts of measures, then it got down to these parties and they say, you know, the most, sure, I'm a populist. That means I'm with the people, of course, right? But, you know, they're not thinking through Murray's definition. And, you know, so it is, I think that is a good point to kind of point out that I probably should have added in here, to be honest, is that none of these parties, you know, kind of use the populist label themselves. So why should we? Because we're struggling for, you know, terms of what to call them. You know, there's a big point that I should probably make here too that doesn't come through the article. I think one of the reasons that I think that the nativism, the anti-immigration was downplayed for so long is that when this phenomenon first appeared in Europe in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of hesitancy to see it as fundamentally a nativist, a backlash against immigration. And there was people look for, oh, it's the decline of the welfare state, or it's this, that, or the other thing, and a hesitancy to come to the fact of a high degree of opposition to foreigners and, you know, and racial resentments within European societies. So the analysis there, I think, kind of, you know, it's got to be populist because, you know, yeah, they're anti-immigrant, but the anti-immigrant is because the elites are not really thinking about them, right? It's not this fundamental racial animus. So, you know, maybe a failure of imagination explains, you know, why analysts, and we all called it populist rather than, you know, just simply anti-immigrant, as I and a couple of other people called it before. But that's a really good point. They don't call themselves, we're the populists. You know, that's why we're different from this, that, and the other thing.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I've always been wondering about this for someone who's been working on these very similar or even the identical movements for so much longer, and yet the terminology has changed during your career from radical right to populism. It's really interesting to see your perspective on these developments. It's great. I have a question from Matthew Putz, which is an interesting one. Do you see a Russian role in assisting the rise of nativism in Western Europe, or does it tend to be solely local and organic among domestic populations?
Yeah, good question. And I became aware of the Russian role when I started getting asked questions about it in 2014, 2015 from U.S. government officials, but from a couple of journalists as well. And I said, I don't know what on earth the Russians could be. So I had a sort of failure of imagination there. I think that we definitely do see a lot of direct connections, clearly in terms of funding. You know, does it matter? Does it tip elections? You know, I don't think you can make a case there. But yeah, Russia was absolutely, you know, using its influence to help these parties to the extent that it could, and they acknowledged it as well, right? Spoke about Putin in quite different terms. You know, not every single one of them, but if you look at the Front National, I think, yeah, there's a lot of gestures toward Russia, positive Russian feeling. So I didn't see any of that before. Didn't even occur to me as a question before around 2012, 2014. But then, you know, something definitely, you know, started to work there.
What about the role of Russian television? I know that in the suburbs of East Berlin and in some parts of the former GDR, Russian television is still really popular. When I was in Berlin in 2013, there was this bizarre hoax. I believe it was at the time, it was a bizarre hoax where people claimed that a young Russian-speaking girl had been abducted in the suburbs of East Berlin, and this was broadcast on Russian media, and it turned out to be completely untrue. She was staying with her friends, and they claimed she'd been abducted by immigrants. So do you think that perhaps the Russian media, the consumption of Russian media in some of these contexts is playing a role?
Very well might be. I think I defer to Lenka on this question, or my colleague Oksana Shevel at Tufts. They would know better than I, but yeah, that is a real phenomenon. The magnitude and how much it matters, I can't really tell. I haven't seen any sort of study on that yet. I mean, there's been some preliminary work, I guess, on Russian election meddling in the United States, of course, but you know, I haven't seen the social scientific work on that yet, but you know, it's probably coming.
Thank you, David. I have a question here from one of our graduate students, Lizette. She's asking about the relationship between radical right populism and economic grievances. She's basically asking whether the social grievances are used as a sort of a disguise. Economic grievances are used as a disguise for anti-immigrant or xenophobic or racist opinions in these cases. And that's part of the problem of populism.
Sure, and some people have I think made that case. I think there's some gestures, or I have some citations on that you know, if you take the opposition to the welfare state, right? Take Ronald Reagan's famous phrase about welfare queens, right? I mean, is that to be read kind of as an economic statement, a critique of the welfare state, or is that, you know, using racial resentment? And I think the consensus would be that it's kind of, you know, racial animus more than an economic grievance. So I take that point. I guess there's kind of what you don't see the economics driving it, though, and that's really interesting. You do see education driving the vote for the radical right. I mean, that's one of the strongest, you know, negative predictors of voting for radical right. Trump vote, I think, as well. And the Trump vote looks very similar to the radical right vote when you look at the profile of the median radical right voter. But we've known, like, for, I don't know, Cass, who's, you know, a good friend and who knows my disagreements about populism over the years, we're in total agreement that, you know, there's been very little credible evidence that economic grievance that has a lot to do with explaining radical right vote. And it is the overwhelming phenomenon. Their frame is nativism, anti-immigration. It's an effective frame for them. And most of their economic policies kind of flow from that frame. So I broadly agree, I think, with what the question is suggesting, that it does, these things, these components are collapsible, kind of in the sense that, yeah, they're interchangeable, but primarily it's the culture drawing upon economic grievance arguments under the guise of economic grievance arguments. But we can see, you know, not just going out and looking for them, but by intention, their racial messages. So yeah, and I mean, there's been all sorts of research on the welfare state and redistribution and the degree to which race, you know, plays a role in people's attitudes toward redistribution. So you may be thinking it's one thing, but really it's, you know, it's the underlying racial animus.
Great, thanks, David. I have a question from Biyol Park, who's asking, I think this relates also to this transition from the narrative being about the radical right to the narrative being about populism, and they're asking about the media. Has the media played a role in distorting the view or meaning of populism?
I think so. But I think academics have too. I mean, my critique has mostly been on academics, many of whom I think are good friends and are doing great work. I mean, I feel a little, you know, bad sometimes, not intellectually, but, you know, going to conferences on populism, going to summer schools on populism, and kind of saying, I don't think there is much there. But I think that academia has given way too much attention to this phenomenon, and I hope that we redirect it. Or, you know, if I'm somewhat successful, there will be at least a a refinement of what we're talking about. And we won't have most of the literature kind of using populism as a broad term, for the article, and then it has very little to do with populism. Or we won't get, the problem of just basic measurement issues and, kind of finding that all parties are equally populist, or this party's not populist like we expected. So, yeah, so it was primarily, my critique is on academics, but absolutely journalists, they find a buzzword and we seem to endorse it, and APSA calls it populism or privilege. And, I say that when they ask me about populism, I try to say, no, it's not that, but it's absolutely. So when populism becomes a buzzword, everybody starts using it, journalists use it. What else is there to say?
And we've run out of questions and we're running out of time. So I'm going to ask you one final question of my own, which is that if people shouldn't be studying populism, what should they be studying? What are the better concepts to be studying?
I think it's a good question. And I think it's not like we're not studying the role of nativism or anti-immigrant attitude or racial resentment or whatever we're calling it in American politics these days. And not to slam American politics, they're great at measurement and concept refinement. But so it's not like there's no research on that. There's a ton. And I say, yeah, I can see that research speaks to me in the sense that I am convinced, although this talk, has been helpful for me to think about, I need to really narrow down this nativism concept and show that it has a standing, equivalent to, I don't know, some other essentially contested concepts that then become consensuses, I suppose. So I certainly want to do that, but we are studying the anti-immigrant attitudes, and certainly more so. I think if there was, the discussion has changed in the United States from 2016, 2017, not just the death of murder of George Floyd, but the whole attention to racial issues in this country. So it's not like it's a impoverished research field. I think that nor is competitive authoritarianism really. And that seems to me, I use that concept. I've found it useful in my own work. I can teach it. I can wrap my head around it. I can do the kind of things that I can't really do with, or have never been able to do with populism. So I'm not saying, oh, there's these neglected fields, right? I'm just saying, let's not build up this one, at the expense of these underlying phenomenon. I do think that, as I went into this research, I thought I was this essay. I was going to focus more on, making the case that it's authoritarianism and nativism at work here. Interesting was this piece about direct democracy through online, through the internet. And, as through my reading of this literature, although Lenka might know more than I do, that's been kind of a massive failure, but has shown what Daniele Casaleggio, if you read my piece carefully, what he designed these platforms to do, which to serve as, referenda, classic, almost Bonapartist devices, to look like you get these, to have this participation, but it's it's really referendal rather than anything else. So that was really interesting, and I think it'll be neat to see where that research field goes. But none of these are really like hidden gems or undiscovered terrain. It's just I guess perhaps intellectual conservatism, although I don't use the word conservative to describe myself very often. But do we need another? Aren't these things that we already have in social sciences, and that we are that we can get a much more reasonable consensus around? Aren't they probably better to have than populism?
Thank you very much. I think that's a great way to conclude. So on behalf of everyone in SPGS and at ASU, thank you very much for this talk. It's been very thought-provoking and illuminating.
Well, thanks. It's been really, really helpful for me. And the points that I got from everyone who chimed in are really, really, really good ones. And if I want to flesh this out more, deal with some of the historical questions, certainly about where Latin America fits. I dodged that very broadly in this article, and also the literature on the populist movements in the United States. Certainly these are big things, and making sure that or bolstering the definition of nativism, if that's going to be a central concept to replace a lot of it. So thanks a lot for that.
Of course, thank you. So with that, we'll conclude the webinar. Thank you very much, Professor Art, and we hope to have you out to ASU in person one day in the not too distant future.
I'll look forward to that. Thank you.
Stay safe.
Okay, you too.